So I'm gonna be talking mostly about the readings from week 7, but a little bit about the readings from week 6. I think that's the weeks we're in. So one of the articles called Lines of Flight, that one confused me a bit. They got into they mentioned how gender is a question of numbers and talking about like uncommon and common ranges, and I didn't really understand too much what that was talking about, like in terms of numbers. And then they also mentioned how like the numbers are reliant on nature, so that made me think maybe they're talking about like in terms of biology, like in terms of like how humans are biologically and how that affects gender. But then that got me confused because there's the whole discourse about is gender biological, or is it more like a cultural thing where sex may be more of a biological factor. So it kind of confused me about what it was talking about. So yeah, and then one of the readings from week 7, I think it was, Queer Theory's Evil Twin. One of the interesting things that they brought up in that article was how transgender studies can possibly resonate more with disability and intersex studies. And I found that interesting because in some of the other readings in the past weeks, it also brought in disability and how there's kind of like a similarity between disability studies and transgender studies based off of like the body, and like how it made me think about that one article about like shame, about how like saying that something is disabled, or saying something is saying something it's like disabled is like saying that it needs to be changed in some way, and how they were relating that to transgender, the transgender experience, about how like since they are off from the norm, that it makes things seem that it makes it seem like there needs to be change, and that brings on shame. And so I thought it was interesting how in this article also it just briefly brings up a relation to disability, but I thought it's kind of interesting how those two studies kind of relate to each other in different ways. And how this article also talked about how in queer studies it tends to be more about the identities in that study tend to be more about homosexual and heterosexual, more focusing on like cis male and female identities, that don't really include the identities of other people, like if they don't fit into those two categories. And how that's why it can be good to have like a separate transgender study, because it talks more about the transgender experience, the transgender identity, and issues that queer study just might not get to. And then in the interview with Susan, I apologize, I don't know how to pronounce her last name, Stryker, I think. Sorry, I don't know how to pronounce it. And how she was also talking about how in queer studies there are certain things that don't get talked about, while in transgender studies it tends to be more, like I said before, about like the identities of transgender people. And how she brought up how she's not saying that like transgender studies is only for like transgender people, it's like inclusive, but how it can be helpful to hear from actual transgender voices and hear about their studies and their experiences. And she brought up the quote, "Nothing about us without us." So kind of like you can't get a full experience, you can't get the full story if you're not hearing it from actual people who have experienced it. And so I thought that was really interesting. And then also bringing up the argument again of how queer studies is more about like male, female, rather than about the anyone in between, or that's in a different, that identifies as something different. Like one of the quotes in that article is, I'm just like a straight person except for who I have sex with," like that type of argument. And she goes on to say, "What actually provides the commonality there between homo and hetero is an argument about who is a man and who is a woman, and how we can tell the difference between the two. Trans studies puts pressure on that tactic argument." I just wanted to quote her because I feel like she said it very eloquently. And I agree with that, like how it's not really talking much, it kind of relates it more to like male and female rather than different identities, and so it's harder for there to be really a connection with trans studies, I think. Trans studies, and that trans studies kind of is their own thing. It's its own topic and its own sort of identity. It's not just like that it's a queer identity, it's more than that, and there's more study about it. There's more well, not more study about it, but that it's a different type of study. It's not the same thing as saying that you're gay or lesbian. It's a whole different experience that needs its own focus. So yeah. And then I typically don't like documentaries, but I really liked this documentary. I can't remember. Disclosure, I think it's what it's called. I'm looking for the name right now. Yes, Disclosure. And they were bringing up a lot of interesting things about how in media you see transgender people or like cross-dressing people always portrayed as some type of like maniac, some type of like the example with Psycho, with the movie Psycho, the like older film, how they're portrayed as like serial killers or like killers, or in more modern representations it's like as the butt of a joke, or they are people who are always killed off, or how they were talking about how in medical TV shows that it's something about their transitioning that is killing them, like if they're making it kind of almost seem like a bad thing. So I thought that was really interesting how they were talking about how representation still has a long way to go, that yes, we are getting there with better representation, how there's the representation of the woman in Orange is the New Black, but even they mention, well, this is still a prisoner, this is still someone who, yes, they show her as kind and like a great person in the show, but bottom line, they're still like a criminal. So yeah, I thought it was really interesting talking about the portrayals of transgender media. Oh, one of the quotes that I really liked that they also said in that documentary is, "Children cannot be what they cannot see." And I find that very true, that if children aren't seeing who they are on screen, who they identify with on screen, then they have no other exposure to it, because media is one of our biggest teachers. Like, we're not being taught, a lot of kids aren't like reading anymore, and so most of their exposure is through media, is through TV. And so that's where they get to learn more about themselves, about who they identify with. And if they're not seeing all these different types of representations of people, then they're not going to get to know about more about themselves or about their own identity. And so I thought it was really important how they're talking about how media is such an important thing for transgender people to get an accurate representation of, because a harmful one can be detrimental to the safety of a trans person and to how everybody else perceives them. So yeah, that was my thoughts.